in the space of our city of Ottawa, that they're welcome and cherished and loved so that they can grow and contribute as professionals in the working place and beyond. So.
It sounds like there's still quite a bit of work left to do. There's a couple of questions around what causes gender-independent children, and that's quite a controversial question in itself. We're going to get to that in just a few minutes. We're going to cut to a break, and we'll be back with Let's Talk CanQueer. Hello and welcome back to Let's Talk CanQueer, the show that brings you the biggest issues facing gender and sexual minorities living in Canada. I almost forgot where we were, and that happens. So just before we left in the break, this show is on trans and gender creative children. There is a question in the research that I did around what causes gender-independent children. And I know that the idea of there being a cause versus just self-exploration is definitely a question. Dr. Lawson, are you aware of any biological cause for gender independence?
There's not a cause for it. It's not a disorder. It's not. It's children whose, and someone's gender is what it is, and people are born with a gender. Society, we assign a gender, but they are born with a gender identity, and it's not caused by anything, as far as I'm aware of, any hormonal or physical or other physiologic reason. Beck or Don may want to add and contribute to this further, but from a medical perspective, no, it's not something that's caused. It just is.
As somebody who was trained as a social scientist, I would want to say that the cause of gender-independent children is society. And it's a society that has always expected us to fit into gender binaries. And so if we can imagine a world, and those worlds have existed in certain cultures where, there wasn't just an M or F box to tick off, then there wouldn't be gender independent or gender creative kids, because there would be space for people to move fluidly around their sexual and gender expressions without it being fixed to their anatomy or their reproductive organs. I very much feel like that is the project around gender creative kids, is not to focus on them as being abnormal in the same way that the WHO didn't take homosexuality off of the list of mental disorders until 1994. Well, we have to remove gender dysphoria from the list of mental disorders in 2014 and recognize that there's nothing pathological about these children or about anybody who wants to challenge gender binaries, that the pathology actually lies in the society that is so wedded to having gender binaries.
There is a medical element, though, in terms of youth who, we discussed earlier, social transitioning, and at what point does hormone suppression therapy come in, and what role does that play?
So it's the primary component or part of medical transition. So, and particularly in the pediatric age group. So at the time that someone begins to go through puberty, if they are gender creative and their body starts changing in a way which is opposite to the gender with which they identify, that can be very upsetting and very disturbing, and that's described as gender dysphoria, and that can either emerge at puberty or it can worsen at puberty. And that's when there's a role for hormone blocking therapy or hormone suppression therapy. So when a child goes into puberty, which for a genetic female would be anywhere from 8 to 13, or for a male 9 to 14, and the body starts changing, we can give hormones that will halt the process to stop puberty from progressing the same way that I would if I had a 3-year-old who began puberty for another reason and I needed to halt it. Use the same hormones which are safe. They're reversible, so there's no long-term effects from them, and they enable the child to have some peace of mind, knowing that the body's not changing in ways which are distressing to them, while beginning to explore their gender further and the idea of transition, and where they can proceed with medical transitions. We use this; it's the recommended first approach in medical transition for the pediatric age group.
In the research I did for this, what I found was really interesting is that comparatively, people who, and there's very little studies because it's such a new field, people who transitioned later in life didn't do as well as people who transitioned much, much sooner. And I really like the idea of hormone suppression therapy essentially just being a pause button whilst they try and kind of really come to terms with everything that's going on. How is the uptake been? Has there been good feedback from individuals going through the therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some emerging studies, particularly from the Netherlands, as the country that's been doing it the longest, but also from Canada and the US, looking at now in 10, 15 years experience in using hormone blockers in youth beginning at the time of onset of puberty, so that sort of 10 to 14 age group, and following them long-term into their 20s and demonstrating that those who started off with blocking hormone and then moving on towards cross-sex hormones with or without sex reassignment surgery have demonstrated that they are healthy and happy, that there's not regret, and this has been a successful process. And so the early concerns that there'd be some regret, that there'd be some medical, physical harm from these hormones has been put to rest in these albeit small studies, but with emerging data and more and more evidence about their safety, and that this improves the outcomes, the psychological outcomes, but also the physical outcomes. Because if you can stop the puberty that shouldn't be occurring, stop that, then you're going to have a better cosmetic outcome, physical outcome. You can prevent the puberty that, for instance, if you've got a trans male, so someone who's going through female puberty but identifies with the male gender, then you can prevent breasts from developing, you can prevent the female habitus in terms of hips widening at puberty. And for a trans female or a genetic male who identifies as a female gender and their body starts to change and they're making testosterone and their voice is deepening and they're getting physical changes that you can't undo surgically or otherwise. And with hormone blocking, you can prevent those changes, the pause button, but also end up with a better long-term physical and psychological outcome.
One of the questions that I had prepared is, and this very much kind of boils into the realm of self-determination by youth, and it's the ability for youth to consent to this medical treatment. Is this something that youth are able to do? I mean, from a broad public question point of view? So
the area of consent is a tricky one. It varies by province, by country, and even by hospital in terms of at what age people can consent, or kids can consent. And at CHEO and in general in Ontario, it's capacity to consent as opposed to an age to consent. And so it depends on what you're consenting to, and a 12-year-old can consent to some things that another 15-year-old might not be able to consent to. So if a child has a capacity to understand what the options are, what the benefits and harms are in the short term and the long term, and is able to make an informed decision, then they have the capacity to consent. Having said that, when we're looking at something like hormone blocking therapy and then potentially cross-sex hormones down the road, although we could do it without parental consent, we really don't want to go down that route, because we know that having parental support is a strong predictor of outcome for trans youth. And it's really important to bring the parents on side and so that they're supporting the youth, and that the youth knows they have their parents behind them, supporting them in this path that they're taking. And so, although you can do it without with parental consent, as would be an exception, not the rule, and that's certainly not the route we want to take.
Have you found that the role of the parent as a supportive mechanism has been of great importance?
Absolutely. The role of the parents is fundamental. I mean, in some situations it's not there, but we want to have more parents be able to support and welcome and love and understand what's happening in the changes of their child and youth, as well as the whole family, which includes uncles, aunts, neighbors, siblings. We don't talk enough about that relationship within that as well. But parents are very key in those caregiving structures, where love is that fundamental piece that helps a child be who they are and want to be. And everybody wants that love and acceptance. And that's, it's sort of like a no-brainer when we sort of break this down and we talk about these separations of gender creative trans kids. We really want to reframe and say, who are we talking about? And we are talking about kids who we care about, who are brothers, our sisters in our communities. And so that parental support is absolutely key to healthy development and being able to move forward. Absolutely. And
we're going to be joined by a parent in just a few minutes as well, as we look at some of the big picture questions. So you've been listening to, watching, I suppose, Let's Talk CanQueer, as we discuss trans and gender creative youth. Hello and welcome back to Let's Talk CanQueer, the show that brings you the biggest issues facing gender and sexual minorities living in Canada. I'm Luke Smith and we are joined by a new guest. Lara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am the co-facilitator of the parent support group for parents and guardians of gender creative kids at Family Services Ottawa.
Exciting. Just before we left, we were talking about, I just want to wrap this up quickly so we can look at some big picture questions. We were talking about hormone suppression therapy, and I think there's a really good connection between the role of the parents and hormone suppression therapy. You were saying about how essentially hormone suppression therapy is a pause. What kind of benefit does that bring to the parents of gender creative and trans kids?
Well, when kids and parents come to us, often the kids, they've known for some time, sometimes their entire life they've known that their gender was different than the one they were assigned by at birth. And but it's taken time and encouragement to finally come out and tell their parents. And so for the parents, it may only have been weeks or maybe slightly longer than that they've known, and they're still grieving the loss of the child who they thought the child was, coming to accept and recognize that the child they've always loved is still there, just different gender than they thought they were, and how to reconcile those. And they're fearful of the future, fearful that the child will face discrimination, may not be accepted by society in schools, neighbors, etc., and about how they would do in terms of health and psychological outcome. And so they're often very reluctant to want to start hormone blocking therapy, and yet on the other side it can be a wonderful way of, as you say, putting the pause button on to enable everyone, enable the parents to catch up, enable them to see how their child does once we put that brake on and pause the puberty and the hormones, and enable everyone a bit of time to breathe and to explore the gender and social transition, and while working with the family closely to get the parents on side, get them to be a cohesive unit, because the parent and family support is so critical to the successful outcome for trans kids.
That was one of the questions I have, Lara, was what role do the parents play? But I also want to pick up on something you mentioned about the parents' fears and about how they are quite real. Earlier at the start of the show, I mentioned some of the really devastating statistics around bullying and discrimination and verbal, physical and sexual harassment that are much more disproportionate with trans youth. I mean, how do parents navigate that in kind of becoming aware of that as a possibility?
They find it hard. Yeah. I see some parents finding it challenging, and I see some parents finding it heartbreaking. And occasionally there's a parent that finds it so easy that you're wondering if the other shoe is going to drop at some point, and it doesn't. But for the most part, there is a grieving process. There is the letting go of this idea of who this child was going to be, and the way that they perceive their child's future relationships. And sometimes it takes them a while to think that their child will still have intimate relationships, can still have grandchildren. They're letting go of ideas, and they're letting go of dreams, and there's this big open void of, we need to learn a lot. And that's scary for families, and not just for parents, but for siblings as well, and for grandparents and extended family members. They have their own coming out process, and they have to come out to their friends and their family. And so we're talking about how important it is for the parents to support and accept their kids, but it's so important, I think, for us to support those parents and where they're at, and then support them in that process as they go along, because otherwise, it's a whole system.
That was that transitioned very smoothly into my next question. How can people in general society help? So, I mean, for the viewers watching the show, what kind of tips could you give to give to them in interacting with gender creative kids, or interacting with parents or families? Like, if you're the uncle of a gender creative kid, what are some tips that you might have?
I'd like to move away from the idea of tips for a second, because tips, if it was only that simple. So really, I think that we need to start from, what kind of institutional change do we need to push for? And that's where it's going to start. We need our institutions, our schools, our sports teams, our churches, and like brownies and scouts, and all of these things where children are, swimming pools and gyms and everything. We need them to expect gender diversity, and then to build their programming and even their buildings from that. So if you're expecting gender diversity, you're going to create a space that is safe for everyone. And then beyond that, in terms of tips, well, you could certainly always try and get someone's pronoun correct. You could ask if there's any kind of cue that there might be a question there. I don't know, Dawn, maybe you have some more tips.
Well, I mean, we think of very practical things like, changing forms so you don't have to tick off a box.
Bathrooms.
Having bathrooms that don't have, these horribly throwback symbols for male and female. on them. I don't think I've ever worn a dress shaped like that in my life, but I still apparently am supposed to go into that washroom. And creating those spaces where you're, the first thing that matters about you is not your gender identity, unless that's what you want to, to lead with. But that it's not, the first thing we ask when somebody has a baby is, oh, is it a boy or a girl? That's actually not the, that's where I want to start changing things. I want to say, is it a beautiful, healthy, happy baby? I'm the mother of two young children, and neither whom we dress in really gender-conforming clothes. I have a son, and an older son and a younger daughter, and my daughter wears my son's clothes because we're too cheap to buy her her own clothes, and we don't really care. And people mistake her for a boy all the time. And I say, she's a girl for now, and then we'll see what she ends up being when she chooses. But I think, for those of us who have done a little bit of the unlearning to, do that kind of soft education, I think is really important too. And I really try to emphasize that around my children, even at their daycare, to say, if my son is gonna go to, I put my daughter in ponytails the other day, and my son insisted that he wanted them as well, and so they both went to school in ponytail, or to daycare in ponytails the other day, and the teacher said, oh, isn't that cute, a boy in ponytails? And I said, no, he's just a kid in ponytails.
Changing his hair, yeah.
Because his other sibling has ponytails too, and that's. And you're going to be okay with that.
It certainly highlights something which has really been missing from this show, and I really want to address that, and that is the voice of gender creative kids. And really having youth-led discussions. It's allowing them to have the leadership in their own experiences, and I think that plays very much a vital role, and I think it plays a vital role in the therapy and so on that we were discussing earlier, and a large role in the social transitioning. In the work that you do, is the importance of children's voices something that is quite prominent?
For us at Ten Oaks, one of our mandates is empowerment through play. And so we really believe that children and youth are capable of a lot more than we give them credit for. And we really try to create the opportunities for them to take the lead in lots of different ways. But certainly in terms of their identities. And so if we have a camper who gets off the bus at camp and all of their forms have been filled out, identifying them as one gender, and they get off the bus at camp and say, actually, I'm going to be, I want you to call me Max this week, then Max you'll be until you tell us otherwise. And if you don't want us to tell your parents that you want to be Max this week, if you're not ready for that, this is just your safe space to try on Max for a while, then that's, you tell us what you need, because our job is to support you in growing up, in all those different ways that kids need to grow up and grow into their identities, and we trust that they know what they're doing, as long as they have strong adults behind them who will create the space for that to be possible for them.
So the impression I'm getting is that there needs to really be a systemic shift towards more acceptance. And I like how you were describing earlier about the cause of gender independence is the fact that there were only two options. So the lack of options, in effect, created the third option. I think what that brings, and sadly that brings us to the end of the show, but we will have links to everybody's websites, the social media. We have a couple of charities here. Very strongly recommend that people go on and donate and help support the work that's being done to really help and support these youth. I want to thank Dawn Moore with Camp 10 Oaks and Lara for joining us with Family Services Ottawa's Parents Group, and Dr. Margaret Lawson from CHEO. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us and really having a much needed conversation around the topic of gender creative youth and kids.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. You've been watching Let's Talk CanQueer, and I've been Nick Smith.